Hi everyone, and welcome to Mammoth Hot Springs and another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. What you're looking at is the Mammoth Hot Springs elk herd. There is a herd of elk that we always see at Mammoth. I've never been to Mammoth and not seen the elk. Very, very often you'll see them actually amongst the buildings, which you can see over there. There's a young bull over there. This, incidentally, is what mature Mammoth Hot Springs bull elk look like. Mammoth is the park's headquarters, and even though some of the other parts of the park and outside the park are either starting to close or have closed for the end of the summer season, Mammoth stays open on a year-round basis because it has to be accessed. I mentioned to you that there's an elk herd that we always see, and that's why you have the sign here. And it's really cool to see elk amongst some of these old buildings. That's the old church that you see in frame at the moment. How cool is this? And no, it's not Photoshop. I happen to have some footage which I shot earlier this summer of exactly the same location, but that time with elk around. You see, this area is actually also known as historic Fort Yellowstone. And this part of Yellowstone has a lot of military history associated with it. It was in 1871 that the Hayden survey passed through Yellowstone, and as a direct result of the Hayden survey, Yellowstone was declared a national park in 1872. It was not only America's first national park, but it was the world's first national park. And as such, the authorities didn't really know how to deal with it. There was a lot of activity in the park at the time that wasn't really condoned by the authorities. You had poaching in the park. This is one of these wonderful old buildings being restored, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. You had poaching in the park. You had people setting up illegal camps around the hot springs and near the geysers. They were breaking off bits and pieces of the hot springs and geysers to sell as souvenirs. And believe it or not, there was even laundry being done in the hot springs. I've told you about Handkerchief Pool, Black Sand Basin, in others of our virtual Yellowstone tours. And there needed to be some way to assert law and order in Yellowstone. We can certainly see the presence of elk here, can't we? So, in 1886, when Congress would not appropriate any money to try and protect Yellowstone, it was decided to send the US military here. And they arrived in the form of the US Cavalry from Fort Custer in Montana. Yellowstone is primarily in the state of Wyoming. About 97% of the park is in Wyoming, about 2% in Montana, and about 1% in Idaho. And where we are at the moment is really close to the state of Montana. We're in Wyoming, but as I say, we're really close to the state of Montana. In fact, when you go follow the Gardner River just on this side of that hill, and you cross into Montana from Wyoming, not too far down that road. And this tells us a little bit about some of these buildings, and I'll get back to that in a minute. And by a stroke of luck, in the very same spot that I was shooting the winter footage, I had previously taken some footage of the elk in the summer, lazing around at the very same buildings. And it's really fitting that the flags are flying so proudly here. I mentioned to you that the cavalry arrived in 1886 from Fort Custer, and in a relatively short period of time they started restoring law and order within Yellowstone. They cut down on the poaching, got rid of the people who were breaking off bits and pieces of the geysers and hot springs to sell the souvenirs, stopped the laundry facilities at the hot springs, shut down the illegal camps, and generally preserved law and order here in Yellowstone. I mentioned that the army arrived here in 1886, and they stayed here for a period of 32 years. And during that time, they obviously needed housing. Originally, prefabricated buildings were put up, but those were found to be really inadequate with the amount of snow that this area gets. So these buildings were erected with, those roofs have been replaced of course, but with those wonderful red chimneys that we see now. And the area between where I am and the Mammoth Hot Springs Hotel, which is that building in the background, was the parade ground. So these buildings housed primarily the officers, but also the troops from the cavalry that came down from Fort Custer in Montana. And I mentioned they stayed here for 32 years. Eventually in 1916, the National Park Service was established, and no doubt you're saying to yourself, well, from 1886 to 1916 is 30 years, not 32 years. Yes, I know, just give me a moment. The National Park Service was established in 1916, and that's when the Army pulled out for the first time. Congress, just as they had refused to do in 1886, also in 1916 would not appropriate any funds to protect Yellowstone and the other national parks. And so the Army was sent back here. And they arrived back in 1917. And eventually Stephen Mather, the legendary first head of the National Park Service, or became the National Park Service, arranged with Congress for money to be provided for the National Park Service, and in 1918 the Army packed up their bags for good and left Yellowstone, leaving it to be protected and looked after by the National Park Service. You've heard me mention Mammoth Hot Springs, and what are the hot springs themselves? Well, there they are, they're coming into view, and that's probably what Mammoth is best known for. You've got both the Upper Terraces at the top there and the Lower Terraces, of course, at the bottom, and you can see virtual Yellowstone tours of both the Upper and the Lower Terraces in our YouTube channel, as well as at our site virtualyellowstonetours.com. That's virtualyellowstonetours.com. This over here is the parade ground that I mentioned. And take a moment to have a look at those tours of the Upper and Lower Terraces. They really are a fascinating part of Yellowstone. Let's take a look at a few quick excerpts from our Lower and Upper Terraces tours. This is Liberty Cap, which you'll pass on the stroll up to Pallet Terrace, and here we're looking at Pallet Terrace from the bottom, and having gone up a little bit, there is Pallet Terrace when you're a little bit further up. Here's a contrast between dead and living terraces, and this over here now is Mound Terrace, which is my favorite thermal feature of this part of the lower terraces. We had talked about elk before, and you don't often see them amongst the terraces, but here they are. We'll now go on to the Upper Terraces tour, and boy, doesn't that look like a moonscape. That was on the trail to Canary Springs, and that's Canary Springs directly in front of us, and then you can take a trail that goes down past Canary Springs, and you get just the most wonderful example of the terraces from the side, and you can really see why they're called terraces. And now I'm back in the car, driving around the loop at the top of the Upper Terraces, where there are some great thermal features and some great examples of travertine. You will recall from the park map, and I'll drop in a copy of the park map over here. You'll see that the roads through the park make up a massive figure of 8, and about halfway down there's a road that runs from Norris Geyser Basin on the left-hand side to Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone on the right, or the east side, and this over here is the Albright Visitor Center, well worth a visit. It's got a lovely bookstore and a place where you can buy souvenirs and whatnot at the bottom. Anyway, if you have a look at the lower loop of the park, you'll see that there's a soft purple line that more or less follows the lower loop of the park, the visitor center, as I mentioned. And that line shows us where the caldera is, or was. That was the gigantic explosion that happened when the Yellowstone supervolcano last erupted about 625,000 years ago. There's Mammoth Hot Springs Hotel, as I mentioned before. So the caldera is basically the area where most of the thermal activity in Yellowstone is currently taking place. Well, you look at where Mammoth Hot Springs is, and I'll drop in another map over here. You'll see that Mammoth is quite some distance outside the caldera. So where is the source of energy? Where is the source of water coming from? Scientists believe that there's basically underground pipes running from Norris Geyser Basin towards Mammoth. And it more or less follows the road from Norris Geyser Basin to Mammoth Hot Springs. Another one of these beautiful old buildings. And that is what is providing the source of energy, the source of heat for Mammoth Hot Springs. I've mentioned the terraces, and they really are, in my opinion, the most dynamic part of Yellowstone, because unlike, and this is the post office, was another wonderful old building, and just check out here how somebody with a sense of humor has put masks on the bears that are guarding the post office, because this is the start of, this is 2020, when the coronavirus pandemic started. I was telling you that that building over there, that is the new Magistrates Court. There was an old one, so that's not one of the historic buildings. The clinic is over there. Unlike in the southern portion of the park, the clinic is over here. And please excuse me, I couldn't resist dropping in some more footage of elk that I shot in the same location earlier in the year, in the summer. Can you imagine going to the clinic and you can't get in or out because there's elk in the way? And looking at that little baby, the elk give birth to their young in Yellowstone anywhere from about the beginning of May to late June. And here they are again, lazing around outside the clinic. Only in Yellowstone you're enjoying a nice picnic and then have to pack up and get out of the way because the elk want your space. And now back to the snowy virtual tour. Unlike in the southern portion of the park, the clinic is over here. Unlike in the southern part of the park where Sinter is brought up at the rate of about 1 to 2 inches every 100 years. 100 years, yes. And Sinter is that white sort of stuff that the water from the geysers brings up, and cone geysers created from Sinter. Well, unlike in the southern portion of the park, over here travertine is brought up from underground. It's a type of limestone, and it's brought up at the rate of about 1 inch a week. And the result of that is that the terraces are continually growing, they're continually evolving and changing, to the extent that the Park Service actually has to move the boardwalks around from time to time. And I'll drop in some footage of that happening over here. I happened to be at Mammoth near Canary Springs when that happened. And you can see that they are rerouting the boardwalks at Mammoth near Canary Springs.
Walkways down below. Yeah, and those ones below we're going to have to pull back also.
Did you hear that? You hear what the ranger says? The ones below they're having to pull back as well. They're taking these back because of the growth of travertine.
Pull back. Actually, when you do take them off, well, you can imagine the scar left in the feet.
So with the travertine coming up as quickly as it does, this area continually changes. And added to that is the fact that some of the hot springs go dormant from time to time, and the source of water stops coming up, and the travertine is therefore not produced. This over here is the original mail carrier's building, that the original mail carrier who leased 2 other cabins on the route between here and Cook City, which is off to the northeast, where the northeast entrance is. He actually put up that cabin so he could stay here when he was in this area before and after making the trips to Cook City. Down over there, the foot of that little mountain, is the Gardner River, which of course flows towards the town of Gardner. That's where the Boiling River is, but that's the subject of another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. And once again, all too soon, I've come to the end of this virtual Yellowstone tour on Mammoth Hot Springs. Thank you so much for joining me on another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. If you enjoy this virtual Yellowstone tour series, please consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel. Remember that you can see all of our virtual Yellowstone tours at virtualyellowstonetours.com. That's virtualyellowstonetours.com. Thanks for watching, and see you in Yellowstone.